I like to keep things pretty fluid and loose, just so that it's not distracting. And when I say distracting, I mean only insofar as suddenly I think people stop looking. People can sometimes stop looking when they're looking for something that they find so quickly. And the intrigue can stay when you're not shown everything you need to see right away. So I like the openness that comes with this kind of fluid, ambiguous figure.
Hello and welcome to New Editions, a podcast from the Studio Museum in Harlem. I'm Habiba Hobson, Senior Curatorial Assistant here at the museum and your host. In this series, we bring you conversations with artists whose work have recently joined our permanent collection. The Studio Museum in Harlem was founded in 1968 during an era of political and social turmoil. A group of diverse artists, community activists, and philanthropists came together to create a space in Harlem for artists of African descent, many of whom were not given attention within museums, commercial art galleries, and the larger art historical narrative. Initially, the museum did not collect works of art. Instead, it focused on providing studio space and educational programs for artists and the Harlem community. However, the founders soon realized the need for a collection that celebrated and drew attention to the contributions of artists of African descent. This historic decision has allowed us to build and care for works that tell the profound stories of our time. In this episode of New Editions, I am so pleased to be speaking with Tunji Adeniyi-Jones. Based in Brooklyn and born in London to Nigerian parents, Tunji received his MFA from Yale in 2017 after completing his BFA at Oxford University. His work is deeply inspired by his Yoruba heritage and carries a distinct artistic style filled with vibrant colors, repeating forms, and characters. As he says, his style is more akin to cultural addition, combination, and collaboration. Most recently, Tunji, along with 7 other artists, represented Nigeria in the 60th edition of the Venice Biennale. As you'll hear in this interview, from a young age, Tunji knew he wanted to be an artist. A trained draftsman and painter, his artistic practice also includes printmaking, which provides a different challenge when completing work. Together, we speak about color, medium, and travel as it relates to freedom and creative inspiration. More specifically, we explore the new addition to the Studio Museum's collection, a watercolor ink and acrylic painting on paper titled A Flashy Encounter. Full of color and sensuality, this painting presents what appears to be the profile views of 2 figures. A fiery and tempestuous background dramatizes the event of their meeting. Who could these figures be, and what is really the nature of their encounter? If you'd like to see this now, please press pause and look up this work on studiomuseum.org. Just search for Tunji Adeniyi-Jones. That's Tunji. Tunji, thank you so much for your time. I first saw your work in person in Dakar in May for the Black Rock 40 exhibition at Dutasek. And so maybe we can just take a second and, start off with you, perhaps telling us a little bit about your background, both culturally and then also professionally in visual arts. Can you perhaps walk us through sort of those aspects of your life and your career?
Yeah, I would say that I have a very, very thorough art education. So I did my undergraduate at Oxford, and then I took a year out, and then I came here to do my master's in painting. And the undergraduate was in fine art and art history. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think I was just really into being a student. I really enjoyed learning from my classmates. I really enjoyed the process and the kind of exchange that was happening. I did feel in London at the time when I was graduating that things were kind of limited for me on a culturally sensitive level. I was one of the only Black students in my entire sort of school department. So I felt like the work I wanted to make that was authentic and true to me wasn't really being enforced by my environment. So my parents moved from Nigeria to England, where they met in like the 70s or something, right? So I'm Nigerian British, and I have around that time I started sort of thinking about my cultural heritage as being the main focal point of my work, and I just wasn't finding the faculty in the UK engaging as much as they could be. I did have one amazing professor, of course, so everyone knows Lynette Yadombache. She was my one professor of color, and also kind of like the other professor, she was a painter, and she kind of just was telling me that I needed to be exposed to more artists of color. So that's kind of what brought me over here. And then things kind of steamrolled in terms of me developing a language and a kind of visual lexicon. And I was just absorbing everything. I think I came with such an open mind and such a lack of a sense of self or identity that really lent itself well to doing an MFA program, especially one as rigorous as Yale. And then you just have to be so receptive in a space like that. You really kind of have to have a relationship with ego and self that is malleable, to say the least. So I just ended up learning a lot, meeting some interesting people, some amazing artists who I'm still friends with today. And the process has just been growing. And I think, this piece in question is a nice kind of expression of maybe a combination of some of these ideas that I've now been thinking about that are to do with Northeast American art history, specifically of the Harlem Renaissance era, and how all of the art that came from that era came to characterize a kind of civil movement and also civil expression. And then that alongside the kind of negritude movement, which happened also in the sort of 20th century, a bit later, I guess, and how those two sort of histories were moving alongside each other. So this is why when I first went to Senegal, it was such a special thing, because I was also exposed to that side of that pretty extensive academia, that like really extensive like Senegalese art historical academia, kind of like Francophone, post-colonial, neo-colonial thought that is so complicated in its own way. But there are lots of interesting interactions between like a Baldwin logic and then also like this, like Leopold Senghor and like certain historians from that period of time operating in West Africa and Europe, thinking about the Black body as this is used in imagery and music and film and anything, right? So in the work I've been doing, it's like, I'm thinking about all of those things kind of coalescing, right? And Flash Encounters kind of it's a very experimental piece, but that's kind of what's fueling a piece like that. Lots of combinations of imagery and history that are focused on a very dynamic kind of figurative representation of the Black body.
Beautiful answer. And I love this sort of like this play and this sort of exploration of the Harlem Renaissance, but also of these sort of Francophonian ways of thought, painting someone like Senghor next to someone like James Baldwin, or putting these philosophers, these thinkers next side by side one another, but in a visual context. What does it look like to sort of visualize these histories as being quite intertwined, encountering one another, and what happens when that encounter happens, like, oh, boom, there's like a flash, or there's some sort of eruption. I think that's super, thanks for that, super robust answer. And, I think I'd love to also to hear more about, this time at BlackRock, in the fall of 2020, and thinking about how this time fueled your practice.
We went to the market a lot. I was looking at pigments, I was looking at fabrics, and I was thinking more about just using my immediate environment instead of, I have all these books, right? I have so many books, and then I'll go to the Met or I'll go to the British Museum to kind of look at objects and artifacts and try and connect with the continent in a very distant, disparate way. But when I was actually there, I found that all I needed to do, I didn't need to go as far as to engage in any specific institution. I kind of just needed to spend time walking around, to just be present, to spend time speaking, terrible Wolof. I couldn't really do it, to speak like very passable French. But, they're very sensitive to that there. So they're just like happy to not speak English. And so I was just being was enough. And that kind of, because here everything is so, I'm trying to, what's the word, almost set up a stage in this way and imitate certain things and try and like, engender kind of moments of cultural inspiration, but it's like you don't have to do that when you're on the continent. Like there's just so much you don't have to do that I'm trying to do here on a regular basis. And this is a choice. I'm happy to be doing what I'm doing here, and I understand my processes are kind of built around that distance. But this was just a moment of like, I just have to go outside and walk around all day, and those normal interactions that I'm having with the person getting into the taxi, or I'm getting some food, or asking for some directions, or I like want to try some clothes on or something, end up being the catalyst for everything. So I spent 2 very, very amazing months there. And I just think that that level of immersion allowed me to shed a lot. And then once again, I was suddenly very receptive. And then going back this year was so special. Last year, sorry, was so special because I got to meet everyone else who had a similar experience, right? We only shared the residency with 2 other people at a time. And at that point, there were maybe 20 something of us. So everyone else can speak as elaborately as I can about an experience they had there to do with something entirely different, you know, but within the same universe entirely. So it was really good to connect in that way, to see how the space was affecting all of us together, and to just have those conversations, to share the space.
I maybe want to just pivot actually now to think more deeply about the work that's in our collection, A Flashy Encounter. First off, I think the title, A Flashy Encounter, just for me suits the scene so incredibly well. I think you have what looks like these 2 beings, 2 spirits, 2 of these sort of floating figures. Maybe they're twins, maybe they're lovers, maybe they're just a mirror to one another, but they're coming together in the very sort of center of the frame. Their sheer encounter, their gaze sparks a fire, sparks, some sort of flashy eruption. I'm curious, how did you, conjure up this sort of scene?
I had also been looking at Charles Cullen's illustration and then Richard Bruce Nugent's illustration. So at that point, that's kind of very specifically early 20th century sort of queer figurative image making. And then that was entwined with Aaron Douglas. And so they would make these illustrations for poems or just for prose and for text. And there was something about how dramatic they always were, right? So it would always be this very dramatic scene of a silhouetted figure carrying another silhouetted figure that's kind of sort of falling backwards or something, or just, it seemed it was always very romantic, or it was always very charged in this way that I thought on a purely image making basis was really inspiring. So I had been thinking about ways of showing interactions in this kind of deeply flat but expressive and dramatic way. And then also there was, in terms of the color, because this work wasn't initially intended for a show or anything, I spent a lot of time on it. I actually worked on a few of these pieces in Mexico. I'd been traveling between London and America, and there were all of these kind of travel bans that meant that you couldn't go one place without the other. So I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and some of these pieces were made there. And so that just allowed me to slow down the picture space and add more sort of all these abstract kind of reactions that are happening in the lower right-hand corner are typically something I maybe wouldn't give myself time to do in a work. And then equally the kind of molten hot kind of red flame in the top left space is a kind of engagement with the medium that I just was able to do because I would just pour some ink there and then I would just leave it, and then I would come back to it maybe in a couple of days. There wasn't quite a specific intention, so the work was able to go through different phases, and there was a different sense of urgency if, like, frankly, there just wasn't any urgency at all. So it allowed for lots of different kind of things to happen at once within this picture frame. And I think previously the work would normally only have one of those aspects, right? There would be, maybe it's all one move. And this was allowed to have quite a few different ones in it. And then the 2 figures kind of staring at each other intensively in the middle. That's really straight off of those Richard Bruce Nugents and those like kind of Charles Cullen illustrations that are just so dramatic, just like pure drama and kind of an intensity.
And you did speak, a little bit about color, and I think this work especially is adorned with deep blues and violets and fuchsias and reds. I think color, for me at least, it can often engineer a feeling. it can often, spark some sort of emotion. And
Mhm.
I guess I'm curious, with these ideas in mind, how do you go about choosing colors for this work? And I guess, what is your relationship to color?
Mm, it's a bit like you're saying. It's
Yeah.
definitely to elicit a response that's emotive. And then I've been trying to just experiment and try and put more things in the work. I
Hmm.
think I sometimes I've definitely created rules and boundaries and restrictions on what colors I can use at once. And
Hmm.
so in a piece like this, you can kind of see me allowing these really cool blues and really deep dark blues, and then some really, really warm and kind of rosy violets and magentas and kind of a fuchsia in there too. And
Yeah.
that combination isn't something I would normally have done in the same space. So uh, clearly like that. And again, it came from this sense of freedom to make this work without a specific outcome.
Mm.
And yeah, just allowing the material to interact. And certainly at that point, what I was looking at also was a lot of abstract work, like
Mm.
abstract painting. And I certainly think artists like Frank Bowling have like slowly started to creep into what I would consider to be a color sensitivity of mine, right? Or like what I
Mm.
would describe as being a color sensitivity. So seeing the looseness and the fluidity of color in some of
Mhm.
those abstract pieces.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, thank you. And I think even thinking perhaps also deeper about your sort of style and technique with this work. So
Mm-hmm.
this is watercolor, ink, and acrylic. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what is maybe even the relationship between paper and printmaking? I know your show at Nickel
Mm-hmm.
Machine showcase
Mm-hmm.
both your paintings and your works on paper. I wonder what challenges arise when working with paper, and sort of like what is that relationship for you between paper and printing?
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
So the thing that the paperwork has offered me, which wasn't happening in the paintings, but is now something I'm going to work into implementing, is you have to work above it, right? So these are made
Mhm.
flat, and I was working, I guess, on the horizontal, whereas the paintings are usually made vertically. I'm drawing on the wall.
Mm.
So that made a big difference on how this is made because I was able to let the material and the medium interact without gravity, I should say.
Mm.
So the water and the ink can pool in a way that's really organic and also in a way that's impossible to control. So you have to just let it do its thing.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of printmaking, working flat, having this kind of pressure that's coming from above down can lead to some really interesting results. And I hadn't been working that way before. So this is one of the first pieces that I was trying that. I think this preceded a series of prints I made that were really loose and kind of a bit more transparent. But
Mm.
ultimately, with this piece, I was experimenting. I thought that I was finding that not that I painted myself into a corner, but I was feeling a little bit restricted by my own rules and boundaries that I kind of work within. So there's a pencil drawing, and the main central figure that's holding most of the space. There's a pencil outline for that character, and then the figure that's coming in from outside of the frame. There's a pencil line for that.
Mhm.
And then that's basically it. There are no more pencil lines in the entire piece. It's all kind of material just placed down. And
Mm.
that's a pretty uncommon way for me to work. Usually I'll map out the whole thing and then color will be assigned to an area. But with a piece like this, it really was, far more organic and far more process driven and process based. Yeah, it's very, very
Interesting.
process driven work. So a bit of drawing to keep the bodies in the middle, but outside of that, a very material process driven work. Yeah.
Interesting. So perhaps this work was more process driven rather
Mm-hmm.
than preparation in some
Mm-hmm.
sense. And
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting, right? Because that you were working on this piece in a time where there was sort of perhaps more freedom to just do and to be, not necessarily a sort of a need to have. Yeah, I guess it was just a sort of an interesting moment where there wasn't so much of a time limit, I guess, is
Exactly.
one
Yeah.
thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's somewhat of a freedom in that and somewhat of a surrendering in that. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's pretty interesting, that this was the work that came out of, that time came out of.
Yeah, very liberating to not
Yeah.
have to kind of, I mean, in a scary moment that is still there and here and are in
Mm.
it, but it was especially just a moment where suddenly it felt like the stakes had shifted a bit in what I felt like I needed to present and how I needed to present myself and to whom. And suddenly a lot of the pressure was taken off with works. I could kind of just give myself some more room.
Mm-hmm. And experimentation, comes out of that, which is beautiful.
Yeah.
Which is great. Yeah, I'd love to maybe speak a little bit also more about your figures. I think for me, your figures have this like timeless and ethereal quality to them. They're both, for me, I see that they're both sort of somewhat representational, but also quite abstract, somewhat like part human, part spirit. These figures are often adorned with rounded edges and curves that imbue a sense of fluidity that further sort of deepen their appearance as otherworldly. I think this is just sort of like, this is me sort of, these are my vantage points, but what drew you to create your figures in this way? And I guess what also about the figure are you interested in?
I guess when this broader project started at grad school for me, I was very specifically trying to represent like Nigerian Yoruba characters, right? I think I was very specifically trying to say like these characters are inspired by this specific history that I am connected to, that I'm interested in. And for a good few years, and to the point where I was, trying to paint deities and things like this. And then I kind of just paused a bit, took a bit of a break from that. Senegal definitely helped with that, to kind of broaden my visual language of wanting to represent a different kind of West Africanness, a different kind of blackness. So then that looseness meant that I could suddenly start representing these bodies that didn't specifically have to be just from like a Yoruba background or something, or from a Yoruba history. And that allowed for this abstraction, because one of the early things was body paint, body scarification, kind of body work. So lines and forms and shapes on the bodies. And so when it suddenly didn't have to become so specific to a kind of tradition, it could become a bit more abstract. So I've decided that I want the bodies to have markings and different colors and shapes and tones. And then that could just become a chromatic exploration rather than like a specifically cultural one. And so that's what's happening in these works. It's just more of a loosening of that specificity of exactly where on the continent these characters are from, but like it's and then rooting that into a more broad sense of where Black bodies situate themselves through time and in space, and allowing for there to be certain signifiers. I mean, these kind of circles that are on the forms and the bodies are still in the paintings that I'm making now, and they were in the paintings that were in that show just now with Nicole, and that's certainly a signifier that's becoming a consistent. Yeah, it's so that's part of it too, trying to build a language within the language, something that carries through with every new representation and rendition. I found that the specificity of kind of sex and things like that were very distracting, only when people were trying to talk about my work in critiques in school. Since leaving, there are occasional moments where it's fine, and I'll like quite clearly say that this is a male dance partner and this is a female dance partner, and they're a couple, or they're something, or there's this. But usually I'll only maybe use it in those terms. Otherwise, I like to keep things pretty fluid and loose, just so that it's not distracting. And when I say distracting, I mean only insofar as suddenly I think people stop looking. People can sometimes stop looking when they're looking for something that they find so quickly. And the intrigue can stay when you're not shown everything you need to see right away, and then maybe you're just not shown at all, but you're staying with the work and you're kind of understanding it in a more open way. So I like the openness that comes with this kind of fluid, ambiguous figure. And things that change that can be quite fun are the kind of almost age and characterization and maturity of these figures, and that's something that can be fun to kind of conceive of. But otherwise, it's the more ambiguous, the better. Now, these kinds of works came before I'd had certain developments of these ideas, but there was a point when I saw Okui's show, Grief and Grievance, at the new museum. And there was that room with Simone Lee and Kerry James, and I've mentioned this in a couple of interviews because that was a really striking moment of seeing the Black body, the Black figure, the Black silhouette all in kind of like immediate proximity in this way that really expressed kind of the things I was trying to achieve in my work: a relation to history, a relation to size, scale, form, and then a sort of relation to almost minimalism and reducing the body in this way, but really heightening it in other ways. And So that work like this is kind of the beginnings of me trying to think, well, how do I want these bodies to make us feel?
Mm.
And how do I want us to engage with them, and what would I want to kind of, your takeaways to be or something, or to feel about yourself or these figures and things like that.
Totally. I love that you brought this into the room again, Okwi's show, Grief and Grievance, because I have heard you speak about this in other interviews. This presence of, like you said, the black figure, the black body, and the black silhouette, and in many ways, I think your figures also engender that kind of multiplicity, of being flat, but also sculptural in some way. I think the way that you have these sort of like rounded edges, and these figures are definitely in the frame, but they're also sort of floating and boundless. They could quite frankly be off the frame and out of the frame.
Yeah.
I think it's also just really interesting to think about ways in which yes, this is a painting, but also who's to say that this maybe can somehow be developed into a sculpture at some point too.
And so everything you're articulating something that's really, really well said. And I really appreciate it, because for a few years I used to see those as negatives, sort of everything that you were describing. And I used to see the fact that these figures were kind of floating and not specifically in a place as being a problem, because it's not realized yet. It's a process, right? I'm still kind of understanding it as it goes. But certainly in the past few years, I've come to understand it as a really kind of promising investigation to just keep trying, because it's quite undefined in a way that is exciting and interesting. I don't have like a clear answer for that bit yet. So.
Yeah. No, it's great. I think, I think I'm just super excited to see what works you continue to develop, right? I think the works that I've seen so far have this like such a three-dimensionality to them. And so, just sort of looking forward to what's to come. Awesome. Yeah, to switch gears a bit, I'm so curious to hear about your influences, those who inspire you, those who you might include in your own sort of artistic bibliography. Are there any books, artworks, films that come to mind to include in this bibliography? I know, I've heard you sort of speak around Chinua Achebe, but who are some other folks or other books or other sort of texts or films even?
There are so many, but I will give some key pivotal ones. I think Another Country by Baldwin, and then Open City by Teju Cole, and the kind of relationship between those two positions of sort of moving through New York City. And I read those when I had first moved here, so it was kind of impactful to have those references, those kind of literative references. And then Americano, I read when I moved here as well. That was pivotal. And then sort of a lot of the associated literature that came with that. I think there are a few short story pieces that she's written as well that were good. And Akweke Emezi's Freshwater was a big one. I think this personification of the spiritual was really done well in their work. I think it's still done very well in the work. And then there's so many books that I've read, but those are the ones that I think are really didn't change, but I was really kind of, they left a strong impression. And then film has been a space that I've been recognizing is quite lacking in my pool of kind of influence right now. Like West African cinema is something that I look into and have been looking into, but I'm realizing I'm not as well versed in as I ought to be. I think it would also be very impactful on my work, but strictly it's kind of been very literature based, I would say. And then work that I'm seeing in person. I mean, I started delving deep into sort of Ben and Wanwu's work and traditional like Nigerian modernist artists too. I've been really kind of looking back at Nigerian artists from like the 60s, 70s, 80s, seeing what they were doing, understanding that a lot of their work was also fueled by this duality of either moving to England or moving to Europe somewhere and coming back and applying mixed techniques gathered in different places. So I've been trying to align myself with that kind of history as well, and looking at their work has been very impactful. Yeah, the classic literature, definitely. Amos Tutuola, Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Cyprian Ekwenzi, Mary Segonde. Yeah.
This is like a full bibliography. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's just like there are so many, and it's like one always chains onto the other, where I see them all as being so connected in this way when I think about them and how they have inspired me at certain points. It's like they all sit alongside each other in this really nice way.
It's so cool. Okay, great. I'm looking forward to digging into some of these texts that you had listed. Just I wanted to ask these final questions that I'll ask each artist. The first being, walk me through your morning. How do you start your day?
So I'll wake up, I'll do some light exercise and stretching in my room to kind of move my body around. I realized a year and a half ago that I was really stiff and had some hip misalignments, and like my mobility in the lower half of my body was off, and that was starting to really affect my work. I was in my previous studio was on a slant, so the floor was uneven, and I was just noticing my knees and kind of feet, like the soles of my feet, my kind of ankles, everything was getting really off because of how active the painting was becoming. So some sort of like physical warm up at the beginning of every day is important to kind of get my body ready for the day. If I'm feeling like I have enough time, I'll walk to the studio. It's about a 25-minute walk away. So I'll do that. I'll have my coffee. I'll have some kind of like granola or some oats or something, and then I'll just go straight into it. Whenever I get in between 9:30, 10:30 time.
Wonderful. Okay, cool. And I guess, the second question, I maybe want to try to reword, but I'm going to just say it exactly how I wrote it, which I think maybe you read, which is, what is the big idea? What's the sort of crazy big idea you do if you knew you couldn't fail? If you knew that it'd be an success, whatever success means to you, what would be that big idea, or that?
That's a great question. And I'm a bit stumped because I have something and I'm like, am I going to remember it? It's a really great question, but I've kind of buried certain fun ambitions like that in my head for more realistic practicality reasons. But I'm really happy you've asked me that. If I knew that that it was definitely going to be successful. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there was a point, and I guess this is what's interesting about this is it's not that I don't think that doing this would be successful. It's that I've had to kind of, through the understanding of the longevity of my artistic career, I've had to kind of put it on hold. There was a moment right after my Dakar trip where I started making this series of paintings that were nothing like any of this at all. They were more representational. It was more kind of like bodies in space. There were some storylines behind it, very narrative driven work. Inspired by a lot of the kind of fiction and literature. And it was people in traditional kind of Islamic clothes and things like this, like West African Islamic relationships and things like that. Stuff that I was finding to be very fruitful. And then I stopped doing it entirely and shelved it. And so to that question, I would love to be able to make just an endless series of those paintings that were kind of just like these kind of stories that would end up looking a bit like a Greek fresco or something in this way, that the way that the composition was very kind of like flat storyboard across a long kind of panel, and it would just be kind of like these figurative storyline paintings that I recognized at the time. It was just there was too much of it in a way that I felt that everyone was doing it, and I liked the way that everyone was doing it. So I was like, it's okay. There'll be a moment when I am able to do it, but it's just like not right now.
Yeah. So just this last question, which isn't really a question, it's more so a prompt. I'm wondering if you can share one question that you'd like for me to ask the next artist.
That's a good prompt. Okay. These are good questions. This is a good interview. It's been very interesting. I think the next person, what was the last piece you saw in person that really kind of left an impression? So for example, for me, I saw the Venice Biennale. It was a crazy madhouse, but it was nice to see like the Belkis-Ayon work in that room with Simone Lee. And so so like that's left a strong impression. So that's like a question I would have. It's like, what was the last thing you saw that like really left you feeling like, damn, like that's amazing? And with the view of it being like maybe at like a thing or like or maybe small scale either, or so maybe in some
to take that question and answer it as they please. But that Belkis work, my goodness, I think I would maybe answer the same. So that those were really it's been so lovely to speak with you. I really, really appreciate your generosity and just like your willingness to answer all these questions and to meet with me.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation between me, Habiba Hobson, and artist, Tunji Adeniyi-Jones. We've recently added one of his works to our collection. It's a watercolor, ink, and acrylic painting on paper titled A Flashy Encounter. The Studio Museum in Harlem is the nexus for artists of African descent locally, nationally, and internationally, and for work that has been inspired and influenced by Black culture. It is a site for the dynamic exchange of ideas about art and society. We invite you to get to know our collection and follow along on our journey to building our new museum in Harlem. For more information on Tunji, you can visit studiomuseum.org or tunjiadeniyi-jones.com. You can access these links and more in the show notes. My name is Habiba Hobson, Senior Curatorial Assistant here at the museum and your host. New Editions is produced by Sound Made Public with Tanya Katengian, Philip Wood, Alessandro Santoro, and Jeremiah Moore. This podcast would not have been possible without members of the Studio Museum's curatorial and communications departments, especially Curator Connie H. Choi, Associate Director of Digital Marketing and Communications Shauna Kudowitz, Managing Editor Meg Whiteford, and Director of Marketing and Communications Isida Jansene. Special thanks to Senior Director of Learning and Engagement Shanta Lawson and Director of Education Chloe Hayward. Much gratitude to Studio Museum donors and patrons, particularly those who purchased or gifted works for the Studio Museum's collection that are featured in this series. Our theme music was created by Mandingo Ambassadors. The cover image was created by Studio Museum's senior graphic designer Megan Tatum. To learn more about this series, please visit studiomuseum.org/magazine. And please share this conversation, write a review, follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.